Look at you. You smell like coal dust and cheap whiskey. You really think any judge in this country is going to believe a filthy, uneducated, colored tracklayer like you invented the greatest communication system of the century? Here, take these nickels, go buy yourself a meal, and get out of my sight before I have my men throw you in a cell for perjury. Right now. You are standing in the middle of a federal courtroom in late 19th century America. The air is thick with cigar smoke and absolute arrogance. The man screaming those vicious words. He is a ruthless, immensely wealthy railroad tycoon who practically owns the city. He is standing there in a tailored silk suit, tossing copper coins onto the wooden floor, like he is feeding a stray dog. The man he is humiliating is Elijah. Elijah is a brilliant but impoverished black engineer. He is standing there in a worn-out, soot-stained jacket, his hands calloused from years of brutal physical labor. Cornelius thinks he has already won. He thinks his money and his skin color give him the absolute right to steal another man's genius and crush him into the dirt. He believes that power can simply rewrite reality and erase the truth. But what this arrogant billionaire does not know is that he just dug his own financial grave. He has no idea that Elijah is holding a single, torn piece of paper that is about to destroy Cornelius's entire empire. To understand how we got to this explosive courtroom showdown, and how a man with absolutely nothing brought an untouchable titan to his knees, we have to freeze this moment and rewind the clock. We have to go back 2 years. Back to the deafening, soot-choked rail yards of Chicago. Life in the rail yards during the Industrial Revolution was an absolute nightmare. It was a world of grinding metal, suffocating black smoke, and constant danger. Men died on these tracks every single week. Trains running on the same lines could not communicate with each other. If a train broke down around a blind curve, the next train coming down the line would just slam right into it. It was a massive, bloody problem that the greatest minds of the era could not figure out. And then, there was Elijah. Elijah was not born into privilege. He did not have a fancy degree from an Ivy League university, but he possessed something much more powerful. He had an unstoppable drive, a mind that absorbed information like a sponge, and a fierce, joyful passion for figuring out how things worked. While other men spent their meager wages at the tavern after a grueling 14-hour shift, Elijah went back to his freezing, cramped boarding house room. He would light a single, flickering oil lamp. He would pull out scraps of copper wire, old telegraph keys, and stolen pieces of zinc. He was obsessed with solving the collision problem. He was the kind of man who never feared failure. Every time an experiment blew up in his face or a circuit shorted out, he did not quit. He just smiled, took a deep breath, and started all over again. He believed in his bones that hard work and intellect would eventually lead to a breakthrough, no matter where you started in life. For months on end, he worked through the dead of night. He sacrificed his sleep, his health, and his comfort. And finally, on one freezing Tuesday morning at 3 a.m., it happened. The small device on his wooden table clicked. It was a flawless, working prototype of a moving train telegraph system. A way for trains to send signals to stations while in motion. It was a magnificent stroke of genius that would save thousands of lives and revolutionize the entire American economy. Elijah carefully drew every single detail of his invention onto a large, crisp blueprint. He poured his entire soul into those lines and schematics. He knew this was his ticket out of the grime. This was his path to financial freedom and respect. But Elijah was naive about the cruelty of the corporate world. He needed funding to patent and build his machine. So, he put on his only clean shirt, rolled up his precious blueprint, and walked into the towering, marble-floored headquarters of Vance Railroad Enterprises. He managed to get a meeting with the chief engineers and, by pure chance, Cornelius Vance himself was in the room. Elijah proudly unrolled his life's work. He passionately explained the mechanics, the electrical currents, and the safety protocols. The room went dead silent. Cornelius Vance stared at the incredibly complex, brilliant design. He knew instantly that this system was worth millions of dollars. But Cornelius looked up from the paper and stared at Elijah with pure disgust. He refused to believe that a man of Elijah's background could create something so magnificent, or worse. He just did not care. Cornelius sneered, rolled up the blueprint, and tossed it back at Elijah. He told Elijah that the design was flawed, dangerous, and completely worthless. He laughed in Elijah's face and told him to go back to shoveling coal where he belonged. Elijah was heartbroken, but he gathered his papers and left the building in humiliation. What Elijah did not see was Cornelius instantly turning to his head draftsman the second the door closed. Cornelius ordered his men to recreate the entire design from memory. He was going to steal the invention, patent it under his own name, and take all the glory and the unimaginable wealth for himself. He thought Elijah was just an uneducated nobody who would simply fade away into the shadows. He thought he could crush Elijah like an insect, but he picked the wrong man to steal from. 3 weeks later, the morning air in Chicago was absolutely freezing. A bitter wind howled off Lake Michigan. It rattled the thin glass windows of the city, but the headline on the front page of the Daily Tribune was burning hot. It read in massive, bold black ink, "Cornelius Vance invents the future. Billionaire tycoon patents revolutionary moving train telegraph." Elijah stood on the snowy sidewalk, his breath pluming in the freezing air like gray smoke. His heart shattered into a million jagged pieces. He stared at the intricate sketches printed on the front of the newspaper. They were his exact lines, his exact mathematical calculations. His sleepless nights and endless, exhausting sacrifices were plastered right there on the page. Cornelius Vance had literally traced over Elijah's original blueprint. He had filed the patent under his own prestigious, untouchable name. And now, the entire country was hailing this arrogant thief as a visionary genius. Rage, a pure, blinding rage, boiled inside Elijah. But he was not a man to wallow in self-pity. He did not just stand there and accept defeat like a victim. He was a man of action, a man who always believed that if you say you are going to do something, you do it. He marched straight back to the towering, intimidating headquarters of Vance Railroad Enterprises. He demanded to see Cornelius. He shouted to the terrified receptionists that the design was stolen. He screamed that the truth needed to be heard. But a man in soot-stained clothes has absolutely no voice in a marble palace. Before Elijah could even reach the grand, sweeping staircase, 4 massive security guards grabbed him. They twisted his arms violently behind his back. They dragged him across the pristine, polished floor, and they threw him brutally out the front doors. Elijah crashed hard onto the icy cobblestone street. His face scraped against the freezing ground, tearing his skin. A crowd of wealthy businessmen and well-dressed women stopped to point and laugh. They pulled their expensive coats tighter. They looked at him like he was absolute trash, like he was an insect that had crawled out of the dirt. And then, the heavy brass doors swung open. Cornelius Vance stepped out into the biting cold. He was wearing a heavy, luxurious fur coat, smoking a premium Cuban cigar that smelled of burnt money and power. He walked slowly, arrogantly down the marble steps. He stopped right in front of Elijah. He looked down with eyes full of absolute, sickening contempt. He leaned in close, so only Elijah could hear his venomous, hateful words. "You really thought you could play in a rich man's world?" Cornelius whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "The law is a weapon for men who can afford it. You are nothing. You have nothing. If you ever say my name again, I will have my friends in the police department lock you in a dark cell for the rest of your miserable life. Now crawl back to the gutter where you belong." Cornelius flicked his burning cigar ash. It landed right onto Elijah's torn jacket. He turned his back and walked away to the sound of applause and laughter from his wealthy peers. For a normal man, this would be the absolute end. This would be the crushing moment you finally give up. You accept that the world is inherently cruel. You accept that the elite will always crush the underdog. But Elijah was not a normal man. He had a mindset built on extreme resilience. He was the kind of person who learned rapidly from every single failure. He wiped the blood from his cheek with a trembling hand. He stood up slowly, ignoring the piercing pain in his ribs. He looked at the towering, oppressive building, and a cold, sharp clarity washed over his mind. He did not need their money. He did not need their marble floors, because he knew a secret. A tiny, brilliant secret that Cornelius Vance, in all his arrogant glory, had completely overlooked. Elijah walked away from the laughing crowd. His mind was already racing. He was piecing together a brilliant, silent plan of attack. He walked for miles, past the wealthy, gilded districts of the city, deep into the industrial slums where the air tasted like ash, until he reached a small, run-down post office on the very edge of the city limits. It was a dusty, forgotten little brick building with peeling paint. Elijah pushed the heavy wooden door open. The brass bell chimed weakly. An old postal clerk with thick, smudged spectacles looked up from his ledger. Elijah walked up to the wooden counter. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from intense anticipation. He asked the clerk to check the outbound mail records from exactly 2 years ago. He gave him a specific date, a specific tracking number that he had memorized. The old man grumbled about the extra work. He walked slowly into the back room. He dug through towering stacks of dusty, leather-bound books. For an agonizing hour, there was nothing but the sound of flipping paper and ticking clocks. And then, the old man came back. He blew the dust off a heavy ledger and slid it across the counter. He pointed a wrinkled, ink-stained finger at a specific line of faded writing. Elijah looked at the record. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his bruised face. He had exactly what he needed. He realized that when you fight a giant, you do not fight him with brute force. You fight him with undeniable, cold, hard facts. You use their own bureaucratic system against them. Elijah spent the next 3 months working in absolute silence. He saved every single penny he earned from laying brutal railroad tracks. He didn't buy new clothes. He barely bought enough food to survive the winter. He used every dime of his money to hire a cheap but honest local attorney. A hungry young man who was brave enough to take on a massive corporation. Together, they filed a federal lawsuit against Cornelius Vance for blatant patent infringement. When the news of the lawsuit reached Cornelius, he laughed so hard he spilled his expensive scotch all over his mahogany desk. He thought it was a pathetic joke. He immediately hired a massive team of the most ruthless, high-priced corporate lawyers in America. He told them to utterly destroy this arrogant nobody. He wanted Elijah totally bankrupt, publicly humiliated, and thrown in a federal prison for perjury. The stage was officially set for the ultimate legal showdown, a historic battle between unlimited wealth and raw, unstoppable intellect, a collision of absolute arrogance and unbreakable willpower. Cornelius thought he was walking into an easy slaughter. He thought he was going to make a brutal example out of Elijah, but as the heavy courtroom doors swung open, and the judge banged his wooden gavel to start the trial, Cornelius had absolutely no idea that he was walking straight into a perfectly designed trap, a lethal trap set by a genius who never, ever backed down. The federal courtroom was dead silent. The air felt incredibly heavy, thick with the smell of polished mahogany and impending doom. Cornelius Vance sat comfortably at the massive oak defendant's table. He was flanked by 6 of the most expensive, ruthless corporate lawyers in America. They wore perfectly tailored silk suits and smirked like a pack of starving wolves cornering a wounded rabbit. For the first 2 agonizing days of the trial, they absolutely destroyed Elijah. They paced back and forth across the courtroom floor, mocking his worn-out shoes and his calloused hands. They ridiculed his complete lack of formal education in front of the entire gallery. They pulled out stacks of completely fake documents, forged by Cornelius's terrified engineers, claiming the railroad company had been secretly developing this exact technology for over 5 years. They painted Elijah as a desperate, delusional, and dangerous laborer. They told the jury that he was just trying to extort money from a respected, visionary American hero. The jury, made up entirely of wealthy, elite businessmen who regularly dined with Cornelius, nodded in sympathetic agreement. Elijah sat alone at his small, cramped wooden table. His cheap, inexperienced attorney looked terrified, sweating profusely and trembling under the immense, crushing pressure of the corporate giants. Cornelius leaned back in his plush leather chair, caught Elijah's eye across the room, and gave him a slow, arrogant, chilling wink. He was utterly and completely convinced that he had won. He thought he had buried this nobody alive. But then, the judge called the final witness. It was Elijah's turn to take the stand. He did not look intimidated by the marble columns or the hostile stares. He did not look like a broken victim. He stood up tall, straightened his worn-out, soot-stained jacket, and walked to the witness stand with a quiet, terrifying confidence that sent a sudden chill through the room. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. He looked directly into the eyes of the stern federal judge. And then, very slowly, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled something out. It was not a new blueprint. It was not a legal brief. It was a small, heavily soiled, tightly sealed brown envelope. Cornelius's lead lawyer instantly panicked, jumping up so fast he knocked over his wooden chair. "Objection!" he screamed, his face turning bright red. He loudly claimed that this piece of evidence was never submitted during the preliminary hearings and must be immediately thrown out. But the judge, his curiosity highly piqued by Elijah's absolute calm, firmly waved the lawyer down. Elijah handed the sealed envelope directly to the armed bailiff. The bailiff walked it up the wooden steps and handed it to the judge. "Your Honor," Elijah spoke. His voice was deep, incredibly steady, and echoed perfectly in the massive, vaulted room. "Mr. Vance claims he invented this system last October. He claims I saw his brilliant design and tried to steal it for my own financial gain. But the envelope you are holding in your hands right now contains my original hand-drawn schematics. It contains every single mathematical calculation, every single electrical circuit. And if you look very closely at the red wax seal and the black ink stamp across the back flap, you will see exactly when it was mailed." The entire courtroom suddenly held its collective breath. The silence was absolutely deafening. Cornelius Vance sat up completely straight, his arrogant, wealthy smirk slowly melting off his face like hot wax. The judge picked up his silver-rimmed reading glasses. He closely examined the back of the dirty envelope. He squinted at the faded, heavily inked postmark stamped permanently right across the broken seal. "This official postmark is from the South Side Chicago Postal Office," the judge read aloud, his voice dropping in absolute shock. "It is dated exactly 2 years and 3 months ago." The courtroom instantly erupted into a chaotic, explosive frenzy of loud gasps, shouts, and frantic whispers. Cornelius Vance turned completely pale, his skin looking like absolute chalk. His heart slammed violently against his ribs like a massive sledgehammer. 2 years and 3 months ago. That was a full year and a half before Cornelius had ever even laid eyes on Elijah. It was mathematically, physically, and legally impossible for Cornelius to have invented the system first. Elijah had deliberately mailed the blueprint to his own home address. He had left the envelope completely sealed for years, creating an undeniable, government-verified timestamp of his intellectual property. It was a genius move. The judge took a heavy silver letter opener and carefully sliced the 2-year-old seal. He slowly pulled out the yellowed, fragile paper. He unfolded it completely and placed it right next to Cornelius's multi-million-dollar patent application on his desk. They were absolutely, perfectly identical. Right down to a tiny, intentional misspelling of the word frequency that Elijah had purposefully written in the bottom left corner, as a blind, invisible trap for any potential thieves. Cornelius's massive, intimidating multi-million-dollar empire of lies just instantly evaporated into thin air. His elite, high-priced lawyers started frantically throwing papers into their leather briefcases, knowing they had just publicly lost the biggest, most humiliating case of their entire careers. Cornelius tried to stand up, stammering wildly, gasping for air like he was drowning. "This is a forgery!" Cornelius screamed wildly, his voice cracking in pure, unadulterated panic. "He is a nobody. He is dirt. He cannot do this to me." The judge grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down so hard it echoed like a literal gunshot. "Sit down, Mr. Vance." The judge roared with absolute fury. "You have committed perjury, corporate fraud, and theft of the absolute highest order." The final verdict was absolutely devastating. A total bloodbath for the billionaire. The court immediately ordered the full transfer of the patent and all its massive future royalties back to its rightful owner, Elijah. But it did not stop there. Because of the blatant, malicious fraud and the emotional damages caused, the judge ordered Vance Railroad Enterprises to pay Elijah a massive, unprecedented sum in retroactive penalties. It was a financial blow so completely catastrophic that it instantly bankrupted Cornelius's personal holding company. In a single, brutal afternoon, the untouchable titan of American industry lost his money, his reputation, his properties, and his entire legacy. As the federal bailiffs moved in to forcibly escort the disgraced, weeping billionaire out of the courtroom, Cornelius looked back one last time. Elijah was standing there by his small table. He did not gloat. He did not laugh at the fallen giant. He just looked at Cornelius with cold, hard, piercing pity. The man who had been told to crawl back into the dirt had just legally bought the entire railroad system. Raw intellect, extreme patience, and unbreakable resilience had absolutely crushed blind, toxic arrogance. Now, let me ask you a very serious question. Think deeply about the people who stood on the freezing street that morning. The wealthy, comfortable citizens who pointed, laughed, and watched the security guards violently throw Elijah out into the ice. If you were walking past that building, and you saw a poor, soot-stained man being physically crushed by a powerful, untouchable billionaire, would you have honestly stopped to help him? Or would you have kept your head down, tightened your coat, convinced yourself it was not your problem, and just walked away? Drop your honest answer in the comments right now. Let us see how many of you would actually have the courage to stand up to power when it is dangerous. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe for more untold stories of justice. Next time, we are diving into a horrifying medical emergency. A brilliant but unrecognized minority nurse has just 3 agonizing minutes to prove a world-renowned, arrogant surgeon is about to make a fatal, irreversible mistake on the operating table. You absolutely do not want to miss it.